Welcome into episode 101 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm August Strometer.
On today's show, the importance of really knowing where you're going online, a hard-earned $11, and picture day is not okay. It's August, and me, and you, for this edition of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. The good news about this story, it will not affect most people listening to this. But a story like this easily could. According to the site Bleeping Computer, a French security researcher has stumbled upon an adware delivery scheme that involves clone websites that use legitimate-looking domain names to trick victims into downloading famous apps, but which are actually laced with adware. Now we're talking about apps like 7zip, Paint.net, Audacity, FileZilla, TrueCrypt, Blender, AdBlock, and others. Now, they fooled people a couple of ways. First, they made the websites look like legitimate sites of the software people are trying to download. Then the second thing they did was rely on typosquatting. Wikipedia defines typosquatting as a form of cyber squatting and possibly brand jacking, which relies on mistakes such as typos made by internet users when inputting a website address into a web browser. Should a user accidentally enter an incorrect website address, they may be led to any URL, including an alternative website owned by a cyber squatter. I'll give you an example. Somebody in France looking for the open source password manager KeePass might type in keepass.fr, because .fr, that's what they use in France. The only problem is that's not the KeePass site. The KeePass site is keepass.info. Bleeping Computer says the version of KeePass downloaded from this fake website contained a legitimate and fully working version of the password manager, but also the install core adware. This type of adware is a modular thread that works by bundling free software with third-party offers as part of the application's installation process. For every successful installation of an additional program, the adware bundler earns a commission. The piece goes on to say some of these offers are legitimate apps, but these types of software bundles have also been known to push apps that are more malicious in nature. For example, in the past, bundles have pushed cryptocurrency miners, adware, search hijackers, tab hijackers, and others. Now, what's interesting is, in the KeePass case, the bogus site, which appears to be still active as we record this, it looks nothing like the legitimate KeePass site, but if you've never been to the legit KeePass site, there's nothing about the fake one that looks fake automatically. So I guess the first question I have for you is, how can one be sure that the site they're visiting is the real site? I mean, like I say, I checked out that keepass.fr, and if I spoke French, I feel certain everything they said looked legitimate because, I mean, from the outside, it doesn't look like it was cobbled together well because keepass.info is open source. I will say neither one looks terribly slick, but each looks as slick as the other. I mean, what kinds of things should people be looking out for?
At some point, you have to rely on your own self to secure your own computer. This is one of those examples where software isn't going to get you 100% of the way. And looking at the URL is, quite honestly, one of the easiest things to do. Now, in this case, they're mirroring or they're brand jacking, as you put it, another site. And that's going to be really, really tough. You just need to know what you're doing. In other cases, the browser has been changed. There were some cases a few years ago where using multi-byte or Unicode characters, you could make the URL look like it said Apple, for example, but it wasn't really Apple. It was some website in the Ukraine. And now Safari, Chrome, and Explorer or Edge all use, they all detect that and put the actual URL in the bar so that you can see that it's a bogus website. So number one, just always check the URL bar. Second, try and make sure you know where you're going. I think this is one of those cases where, like, if you're trying to go to a Toys R Us and you walk into a bar, well, it's on you that you went into the wrong place.
I gotta say though, I understand what you're saying, but here's like one thing that I rely on. When I go to a website, one of the things I look for is for the information to be green up at the top, right? Because that's sort of an indication that, okay, Apple or whoever, whichever browser I'm using, has looked at it and says, yes, this is that legit site. But the thing is, when I go to keypass.info, I don't get any indication that this is the real place. I only know it's the real place because I saw it in Bleeding Computer. And I tried the same thing with Audacity. The thing is, Audacity is not even audacity.com or audacity.info. It's something else entirely, which is weird because you think if I want this app and it's a popular app and it's out there all over the place, then probably I can just type in the thing that I want.com and go there. Not the best way to do it, obviously, but I guess what I'm wondering is, how far would you go to make sure? Do you go and read articles and make sure you find it? Do you search Google for that and just know that the top 5 things are going to be ads anyway? Because, that's another problem, right? If I go to Google and type in Audacity, what's the chance that Google is going to give me 3 other things that compete with Audacity or, that are comparable to Audacity first because somebody has paid them to do that? I guess, forgive me, I know I keep asking questions and then stopping, and I'm really going to stop now. What steps would you take personally to make sure that the site you're going to is the right site?
Well, if it's a site that I'm just not sure about, especially with the domain extensions, the .fr, .com, .info, I think the Google suggestion, while it can get a little confusing, is a fantastic one. Google will list the top sites if you can get past the ads. They will list the top sites in order of whatever ranking Google uses. And you can pretty much be sure that a bogus website is not going to list at the top of that chart, whereas the real site will. And, I had a conversation, this was a good several years ago, with somebody where I was talking about how the internet is great, but one of the biggest problems with surfing is that it requires you to know how to spell. And this is exactly one of those exploits that just, forces people to know how to spell, or at least know exactly where they're going. Trust the try and look at the information you've been given, and don't just trust that you can type a domain that you've never been to correctly. If I'm going to google.com, it's pretty easy, but if I'm going to newsearchengine.org, then I'm going to be a little more cautious about making sure that the site that I bring up is the site that I want.
I got to figure, too, one of the ways that this worked is because we're talking about either freeware or open source or something like that. Going to apple.com is an easy one because we all know what Apple is. We all know what Apple looks like, and apple.com will take you where you want to go. Like I said before, Audacity I know is free, and while it may not be being put out as an open source thing like KeyPass, it's not, as flashy as say Adobe or, going to pick up Audacity or something like that. The other thing I'll say is if we were only talking about KeyPass, this might not be a huge deal, but as I mentioned before, we're talking about a number of utilities. I said this wouldn't affect most people here because, or most people listening to this, because they're primarily targeting users in France and Spain. But this is the kind of thing to which people could fall here as well. Now, Bleeding Computer says when downloading any software, even from official websites, it's recommended to scan the software with an antivirus or upload it on VirusTotal for a quick checkup. VirusTotal may not be perfect, but it will detect some threats and spare users from occasional headaches. On the one hand, this to me seems kind of paranoid. On the other hand, we have seen situations where apps downloaded from trusted sites have been bundled with bad news. I'm thinking of last year when the installer on a Handbrake mirror site was replaced with a file that contained an Apple Trojan. Is running everything you download through something like VirusTotal a step too far? Or are we talking about degrees of paranoia? If you were somebody who wants to make 100% certain, then you do this with everything you download. Is there any time that you can see yourself doing that? Or are you sort of thinking that just talk to me about that idea. Is that something that you would do or that you would suggest?
Sure. On the Mac, everyone kind of grumbles about Apple's walled garden. But honestly, that's a really good way to make sure that the app that you want is the app that's being run. And there's 3 different levels. There's only trust things from the App Store, only trust apps from developers I trust, and then Wild Wild West. Those are pretty much your 3 settings. And if you've got it set on Wild Wild West, then you better be darn sure you know what you're doing. I'm not super paranoid about all that stuff. But even I don't have it turned on Wild Wild West. And if I find an app that I know that I can trust, if a buddy's working on something and he just doesn't have all the certificates set up and he says, hey, give this a run, I'll turn it off just long enough to install it and run it. And then I'll turn it back to a setting that I'm a little more comfortable with. Just simply because, at the end of the day, I don't want to have to be super paranoid about everything I install. I'd like to let the software do some of it. So if you've got it set to let any app run on your Mac, you better know what you're doing. And if you don't know exactly what you're doing, then dial it back a little bit and let Apple help you in that regard.
Is middle of the road your general suggestion to people? Or would you say go Mac App Store only? Or is it like for your mom, you would say Mac App Store only, but for, your friend who's maybe a little bit more tech savvy? I'm not saying anything about your mom, by the way. But I mean, for people's moms, for people's grandmothers, for their aunts, their uncles, the people who maybe aren't quite as tech savvy, or their friend who is exactly their same age and just doesn't know much about computers. Do you, generally speaking, suggest the Mac App Store only, or do you suggest middle of the road for people?
Yeah, I suggest Mac App Store only, which is really easy because that's the default. You've got to actually go in and change those settings. And if they're in there monkeying around with the preferences to change what they can install, then I kind of feel like they've progressed to the point where they're allowed to download something that's not from the App Store. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't still be cautious, but, Mom is a great example. I would tell her to leave it on App Store. And if she says, but she found this really cool app, then I would say, what, you Google? And then after I got past that question, I would, I would say, I would just stick to the App Store, Mom. It's safer. And like I said, if you've got relatives who are really heavy computer users, I'm sure they have progressed to the point where they understand the levels and what they do and the repercussions of opening their computer up to third-party software.
And of course, running some sort of antivirus software like, MacScan 3 by SecureMac or some other reputable antivirus software is essential. Although, funny enough, I think you might have to set for the middle of the road setting to install a lot of reputable antivirus right. Solutions, because Apple is not without a sense of humor. Heed the harrowing tale of one Natalie H. I call her Natalie H because her first name is Natalie and her last name starts with H, and she's been the victim of a weird sort of identity theft / cyber attack. Emphasis on the weird. I make a point, by the way, of not identifying her, even though CBC News out of Canada and iMore both gave her full name and the city in Ontario in which she lives, and she is 15 years old. And she let them have all that information, so I guess learning is not one of her strong suits. Here's what happened. This is according to iMore. A 15-year-old in Ontario traded in her broken iPhone for $11. Once refurbished and resold, a creepy man in Dubai had access to all of her data. Nearly a year after Ontario teen Natalie H. sold her shattered iPhone 5 at a T-Booth mall kiosk, an individual in Dubai contacted her, notifying her that he had possession of her old phone and, as a result, all of her data as well. CBC News says a man messaged the 15-year-old on Facebook saying he had bought her used phone in Dubai and the device still had all of her data on it. To prove it, he sent her a screen grab of her old phone's camera roll, commenting on the sweet photos of the teen, her friends, and her dog. I was overwhelmed, she said. It's creepy having your pictures and your contacts and your social media, text messages, all of that kind of stuff out there with just a random stranger. But believe it or not, it gets worse. Since all of her info was still on the phone, so were all of her social media accounts and logins and all that stuff. The guy used the data on the girl's phone to gain access to her private social media accounts, requesting her as a friend, then accepting his own requests from inside those apps. Sounds stupid that she wouldn't have wiped it, right? But here's the thing, the phone was super busted. It was no longer operational, says Imore, leading her to believe that even if she could accomplish a factory reset before trading it in, it was unnecessary. It was so broken to the point where the guy I sold it to couldn't even use it himself, she said. For people to say that it's common sense to wipe your phone, I don't know if your phone is that broken. Since the incident, the piece says, the girl has taken steps to protect herself, blocking the man from all social media accounts and resetting her password. CBC also reached out to the man, who apologized for his conduct and claimed that he has now wiped the phone and sold it. Three things. First of all, CBC News reached the guy, so it would seem they know his name, but they didn't post his name, but they posted the name and city of residence of an underage girl. And if somebody wants to explain that to me, I'd be more than happy to listen. Thing number two, I will remind people that the very first episode of the checklist, brought to you by SecureMac, was about preparing your iOS device for sale. Steps included there. Unpair your Apple Watch from your iPhone, make a backup of your iOS device, contact your carrier to unlock your device, ways to maximize your phone's resale value, and this part is in bold, wipe your device and remove it from Apple services. So here's my question. This is thing number 3, by the way. I'm not 15 years old, but $11. $11, man. If you have a device that is so badly damaged that you can't see whether you've cleared it and all you're going to get for it is $11, what is your suggestion for people at that point?
Don't.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, here's the thing. It feels a bit like nuclear waste, because I'm trying to think of what you're going to say the answer would be, but she really can't get in. I would imagine if you took it to Apple and said, I want to get rid of this, but I need to clear all the information. I mean, maybe they have some kind of diagnostic something or other where they would be able to go in and wipe it without seeing the screen. I mean, could they do that? I guess, theoretically they could, right?
Theoretically they could. I'm going to go out on a tangent here. In movies where they do all these crazy things with computers and they hack into traffic systems in 30 seconds and all of that. And yeah, we know that most of that is just totally bogus, but it's fun to watch. The scenes where like a computer gets dropped from a 10-story building and they reach in and they pull out the hard drive and then they go recover the data from it, that happens.
Right.
That isn't fake. That kind of stuff happens all of the time. And it doesn't matter whether it's dropped out a 10-story window or, your computer just went kerblooey or even the hard drive itself might have had issues. But it is possible to recover data from both old disk drives and then the new flash, the solid state drives. And,
right.
In this situation, her best bet is probably just take a hammer to it and, put it in a dumpster. But barring that, Apple would have been a better choice. I have a little bit of trust that Apple would at least try and do the right thing. But even that said, every time I've returned a phone, exchanged a phone with Apple, they make me watch while I reset my own phone so that I can be sure that the data is gone. But I can't trust some punk in the back room to do that. And that's why they have me do it, because they want me to be, to let them off the hook liability wise, number one, but number two, to be safe and secure that I did get rid of the data. So I think this is one of those cases where, just get rid of it, melt it down.
See, this is the thing I was trying to figure out. I said a minute ago, I felt like it was sort of like nuclear waste. I can't imagine a company that's actually concerned about security is going to want to handle this phone unless Apple's going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. But if she walks into an Apple store and says, I need to make sure this phone is wiped, but I don't want to leave it with you because there's a guy, at the T-Book or whatever that was called, who was going to give me $11 for it. I mean, is Apple going to want to go through all of that trouble to hand you back a clean, though useless phone for which you're going to get no money? It's funny you said get a hammer. You remember the videos, Will It Blend?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of blend tech. I was thinking maybe every Apple store should have a blend tech, right? So if you go in, don't even want to bother trying to get the information off it. They'll just completely, nuke the whole thing. There's one other weird thing about this story, and I don't know what you would be able to do. I don't know how you could do this unless you just say Apple's my place from now on. This 15-year-old kid sold her phone for $11 in a mall in Ontario, and it ended up in Dubai. That's mind-boggling. There is no way that any part of her, heck, I wouldn't have thought of that. I mean, I guess I would have considered the possibility, but it never would have occurred to me that, this phone easily going to end up halfway around the world in the hands of a creeper. iMore says this story stands as yet another warning to be certain that you've wiped your data completely before selling or trading in your device. As CBC's piece states, many companies who buy back used iPhones ask that you reset the device yourself. Hey, there's Mr. Trometer talking. Since they can't assure that any data you leave on the device will be deleted. Blend techs are not cheap, but they are effective. So let me tell you about something that happened to me recently. Then you tell me, August, whether I was right to be freaked out by it and what I should have done. I went to an event. This event had a thing where you could stand in line and have your picture taken. While it didn't cost money, nothing is free. They wanted your first name. Well, not yours. They wanted my first name, my last name. If you were in line, you're like, can you give me August's last name? I'm like, yeah, it's Trometer. It's on the website. It's like, oh, cool. What's the email address? And then I got my picture took. They wanted the first name and last name of the people who were in line and an email address for the people in line. Now, there were 3 boxes to check. One said that you agreed to be sent promotional information. The second said that you agreed to their privacy policy. And I honestly don't remember what the third one was. So I tried to opt out of the one that said you can send me promotional information, but it wouldn't let me do that. So I guess opting out of that would be I don't get my picture taken. So fine, I click that because whatever, I've got an email address that I use for stupid stuff like that. Of course, I clicked that I read the privacy policy, even though that was a joke because you're standing in line. There are people behind you standing in line. You've been standing in line for a while now, and you're there to get your picture taken. So who is seriously going to read the privacy policy? Right? I mean, when we have time, most of us don't read the privacy policy. I go back and forth on it. I know I always should, but they make it 33 pages of stuff you don't understand. So that's difficult. We've done shows about that. Go back and check the back catalog of the checklist. Here's what really got me, though. When I typed in my name, it tried to auto-populate the name. I typed in Ken, and it had Kent as a possibility. Okay. I mean, that sort of makes sense. Same thing with the last name, right? It tried to anticipate my last name, what it might be, until I, skipped on to the third field, which was my email address. So at this point, I'm thinking, it's trying to save me time. My last name might have been Raymond. So, Kent Raymond might have been me, right? But no, it's Ken Ray. So fine. Did the same thing with the email address. Except at that point, it wasn't actually trying to figure out what my email address might be. It was just showing me the email addresses of everybody who had gotten their picture taken by this particular troop. I typed in the first letter of my email address, and this huge list of email addresses popped up on the screen, all starting with the same first letter. I was 3 letters in before I realized that that's what was happening. And I'm staring at a bunch of other people's email addresses. Now, I can tell you why this freaked me out, but first, you tell me whether I should have been freaked out by this.
I think you should have been concerned. I don't know if freaked out is the right word. In a situation like this, I mean, either there's malicious intent, in which case that's a freak out sort of situation. And then there's some idiot just didn't put controls on the software. And
right.
That's what this sounds more like to me, that somebody just wasn't thinking. And so it wasn't really a freak out situation. It was more of a hey, this is not right. This shouldn't be happening like this.
Yeah, I mean, my assumption is that because obviously they're collecting emails, so I'm not freaked out that they had 50, 60, 100, 1,000, however many emails they had. The part that freaks me out is the fact that I was able to see them. And I'll tell you the reason that I was freaked out was because, people are weird. Like, what if I had a stalker? Or what if I was a stalker, right? Then all I have to do is wait and see whether the girl or guy that I'm stalking, maybe it's a business deal gone bad. Maybe it's not even about, passion or affairs of the heart or whatever. Let's say there's somebody in there that I want more information on, right? So if I see that they're in line, I go stand in line behind them, or I go back later and see if there's some way I can scam their email. And it's an email they use because you have to supply a working email to receive your picture. They're not printing it out, they're emailing it to you, right? Now, I was telling Nicholas Tocek about this earlier this week, and he asked if I reported them. And my immediate thought was, to whom? It's a big event with a lot of vendors. I don't know whether whether the people who are doing this worked for the event organizer or if they worked for another vendor. And I also don't know that anybody would have cared. Certainly not anybody to whom I could have spoken. Because, it was a couple of 20-somethings running this thing. And I'm not saying that 20-somethings don't know anything. I'm saying I got the feeling that these were people who were hired to do this every now and then by a bigger organization. But those guys aren't necessarily going to care. And I can't imagine whoever set up the infrastructure was actually on site saying, oh, yeah, we probably should have clicked that box. I guess the question that I have is, is there anything I should have done? Should I have gone to one of the 20-somethings and said, hey, guys, or should I have gone to the show, organizer, or, what would you do in that situation?
Well, first of all, I've got a couple of questions. Question number one is, what kind of shady events are you attending where they're giving away people's email addresses? That's what I want to know.
Okay, that's cute, but here's the thing. It's not, okay, so can I tell you what's funny? I've been to, and I was trying not to give anything away, I've been to 2 events in the past 2 weeks where this same organization was doing this. I didn't bother getting my picture taken at the first one because I knew they were going to be at the second one. The first one, though, was significantly bigger, which means significantly more people, which means greater chance of weirdos. And I don't know whether they had this security flaw, which I'm going to go ahead and call it that, or at least, not a security flaw necessarily, because I don't know if there's a technical term for that. This bit of lack of security may well have been at this much bigger event as well.
I would characterize it as a data leak, perhaps.
A data leak, that's fair. You might even just say potential data leak, because seriously, I was well into it before I realized, hey, I'm looking at other people's email addresses. So, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I think any sort of autofill mechanism, which is what they were using, it has to have data in which to autofill from. The names make perfect sense to me unless it's bringing up last names along with first names. The email address, I think, is just an oversight. And when it comes down to it, I feel like an email address is a powerful piece of information. But our email addresses are all over the place out there. That said, I do think that contacting the organization and letting them know that this is not the way they should be operating is probably the right thing to do. I understand the whole stalking thing and it can be misused. I think somebody would have to know in advance that that's the way it works. Which is kind of a long shot, but at the same time, you never know. So I think reaching out to the organization, especially, if you know that they do this on a regular basis, and if you've been to 2 events where they do it and they've been at both events, then the likelihood of them being at a 3rd and a 4th and a 5th event are pretty high. So, reaching out to somebody there and saying, hey, just notice this. I'm talking about it on my security podcast. Probably something you guys should address, and that might actually get it addressed.
Let me hit one other thing really quickly. Both of the events that I'm talking about were multi-day events. So you're right. The chance of me knowing ahead of time that that's what happens is pretty slim. But if I stand in line and then I pass by the next day and I see that other person standing in line and I've already picked up the first time, then it's not a matter of knowing ahead of time. It's a matter of being willing to stand in line again.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
I mean,
absolutely.
Potentially. Look, we've talked about a number of security issues on this show in the past where it's like, okay, so if this is set to this and this is like this and the moon is in Saturn, and, then maybe the only problem is, I mean, that's how big problems start, with little things that nobody notices.
Definitely. And that's why I would say that this isn't a freak out. This is more of a, hey guys, you need to get this addressed. I feel like it's a little bit like when, the iPhone, it was an Apple app. It was the fitness app. The Nike fitness app was tracking your location. Mm-hmm. And then, there was the potential, because of the Bluetooth connection, or I can't remember exactly the situation surrounding it, but there was the potential that a stalker could then, find your location while you were out running, through the park or whatever. And very, very good concern. But obviously that's not the reason Apple set it up. So, there's no malicious intent. That doesn't mean it can't be used for nefarious purposes. And this is one of those things where I think it could be used badly, and reaching out to the organizers to, get them to at least put some sort of control on that is probably the best solution.
We've covered a bunch of stuff here, and we cover a bunch of other stuff other times, and there is a place that we would love for you to go check all of it out. I mentioned earlier that the very first show of the checklist, brought to you by SecureMac, was about the very first story today. So 101 episodes back, or maybe it's 100 episodes back, the one about preparing your phone for sale, or preparing your iOS device for sale. And then other stuff that we've had today as well. Just the place to check out is securemac.com/checklist. Notes about every show that we have done so far and every show to come. And you can listen to them right there. securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.